Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to give folks a few minutes before we get started. Oh, I already see some staff members and our volunteer garden leaders, so thank you all for coming. It's kind of a dreary day. It's been raining off and on, so pretty good day to be inside for a webinar learning about gardening safely. So we like it when that works out. Actually, while we are waiting for folks to join, I will give a not so shameless plug. Springfield Community Gardens has an event coming up. It's not this weekend, but next weekend on Saturday, October 7th. And it is going to be out at Mother's Brewing Company. I'll put the flyer up on the screen. It's at Mother's Brewing Company. It's going to be from 3 to 8 p.m. It's free to enter, and we definitely encourage families and everyone to come out. It's called Garden Palooza, and we want to get you excited about gardening and getting to know people in your community. It's also a celebration of our Ozarks agricultural heritage. So we have a lot of fun activities planned that tell stories of Ozarks farmers and gardeners and the legacy of growing food in our very unique region. So if you are in the Springfield area next weekend, please definitely come by. Like I said, it's free to enter, which is nice, but then if you'd like to purchase food or beverages or do special activities, you can buy special Garden Gold tickets in order to do that. But if you don't want to spend any money, you can still come and listen to great music and do lots of other fun, free activities. We've got definitely something for everyone and folks of all ages. So let's see, we have a few people who have joined, so I say we can go ahead and get started. So I'll give a quick introduction of myself and Springfield Community Gardens. In case you don't know me, my name is Anna Withers, and I'm the Farmer and Resource Development Manager for Springfield Community Gardens. So I do a lot of our fundraising as well as farmer outreach. We envision a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And so that means that we grow a lot of our own food and donate it. We also do take some to market and take the sales from that, but we also grow growers. So that's why we put out so much educational programming, because we want the people in our region to have the education needed to treat our soil well and grow using regenerative practices, do so safely, practice produce food safety, all the good things that us growers need to keep in mind. So we run 16 community gardens, 3 urban farms, a commercial test kitchen, and a community food forest, all right here in Springfield. And today we are joined by Sabine Martin. She's president and owner of CTOR Solutions. And this workshop on gardening safely in soils with lead and heavy metals is part 2 of a series. And it is generously funded by the 2501 program from the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement. So just a reminder as we get started, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sure to take time at the end to answer your questions. And if you don't mind keeping that separate from any comments that you might leave in the chat, that's helpful so that we can just make sure to get everyone's questions answered and not miss anything. And I will say there will be a couple opportunities for audience participation today. So please help us out, and we'd love to hear a little bit more from you and just make sure that we're delivering the content effectively. So stay tuned for that. And then last thing, when you leave this workshop, there will be a screen that pops up with a link to a post-workshop survey. And that survey is very important to us. It's used in our reporting to the USDA, and it also helps us provide meaningful workshops for you in the future. So if you can just take a moment or two to fill that out, we'd really, really appreciate it. We'll be sure to add the recording of this workshop to Springfield Community Gardens YouTube page. We have a whole library of these agricultural videos on a playlist, so they're really easy to find there. And you can also follow us on social media. We're very active on Facebook and Instagram. We post all of our workshops on our website. So definitely follow us and stay in touch with what we have going on. And I think that's all from me. So thank you again for being here, and I will go ahead and hand it off to Sabine.
All right, thank you, Anna. So what I will do is I will stop my video and share my screen. Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes, it's not at the beginning, but I can
Right.
see your screen.
Yeah, and I still need to get this bar down here. There we go.
Beautiful, looks good.
All good? Okay, so as Anna said, this is the second part of a webinar mini-series here, Gardening Safely in Soils with Lead and Heavy Metals. And what I'm going to do is, well, if this would work, good Lord, why can I not advance my, okay, here we go. Just took a while. Here we go. Just going to do a little bit of recap as to what we talked about last time in case you did not participate. Just a few slides, nothing major. So first off, I mean, the sites that I'm going to be talking about, and I did talk about, it's what we call brownfield sites. And this is like the official definition of a brownfield site. It's real property of which the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse, which of course includes making it a community garden, may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So what you see here is a brown field, but that's not necessarily a brownfield site because it could be that this was always used for farming. It is in farming, so that's all good. However, if you look at a site like that, which you might be more familiar with, like in a city, a vacant lot, may have been residential, kind of depends what's around it, but definitely not in use, underutilized. It could be contaminated because you don't know what's been there, right? So that's what a brownfield site is. So here's some examples, some residential lots. This one here, that one is actually in Springfield. This used to be a gas station. So was this. And this was a thermometer factory right across from an old high school. And that's just an apartment lot with a whole bunch of, well, what I would call garbage in front of it. So these are all brownfield sites, underutilized. You don't know what's there as far as potential contamination is concerned. Site might be totally clean, but without any analytical and any sampling, you just don't know. And especially if you want to establish a garden, you want to know what's in that soil, what potentially could harm you. So here's some gardens, all on brownfield sites, just like a pretty picture. This actually, this used to be a tennis court. You can still see like the actual tennis court in the back here. And they decided to use the court to grow. And it seems to be working really well, although there was like the potential problem of drainage, of course, but didn't seem to be a problem. Okay, so the other thing we talked about is contaminants in urban soils. And here are a few of those listed. We always assume that residential lots are squeaky clean. I mean, what could potentially be there, right? But then if you go through the list here on the left side of the screen, you could have lead in the soil from lead-based paint when that was still used and leaded gasoline. You could have like arsenic or other pesticides persistent in the soil when they sprayed around foundations. You could have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from incomplete burning of carbon-containing materials. That could be wood, that could be coal, metals from the coal ashes, way back when a lot of people were heating with coal. PCBs from leaking transformers, asbestos. And then, of course, if you look at other properties aside from residential lots, you may have former manufacturing facilities, industrial sites, solvents, metals, and persistent organic chemicals. So there's a lot of potential for contamination in a given scenario. So lead is really the most common contaminant in the urban environment. And again, I already mentioned lead-based paint, automobile exhaust from the use of leaded gasoline, waste oil has lead in it. Lead is a probable human carcinogen. And if you have elevated blood lead levels, and that's mostly for kids, that can cause detrimental health effects, but also in adults. On average, lead levels of 200 to 300 milligrams per kilogram are fairly common in urban soils. So just remember that. The other takeaway from the last webinar, was that lead is not distributed evenly in the soil across a site. So I'm giving you two examples here. The darker colored areas here in this image, those have the higher lead concentrations, and you can see it's a concentration of higher lead here, and then it peters out a little bit. There's nothing here, but there's something there. And the same here. If you go over here and you look at the light blue numbers, they're all over the place. So there is not necessarily a rhyme or reason for this. So just be aware of that as well. Oh, and one thing I also should mention, what we talked about was contaminant uptake into food crops, vegetables mostly being grown on such site, and that uptake is minimal. There is a little bit there, especially if you grow root crops like carrots, sweet potatoes, and the like. But anything else, it's not bad at all. Not that the root crops are bad, but it's even less when you look at lettuce or tomatoes, and definitely not any orchards, any fruit from orchards. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look a little bit more in depth what you should do when you maybe acquire a site, contemplating working on a site, installing a garden, what you should do and what you should look out for. So we're looking first at establishing a site history, so you know what was there, what could impact the soil at the site. Then how do you determine if the soil has contaminants in it and how many? And then the best management practice to alleviate those potential contaminants. All right. So before you acquire a vacant lot, and we're talking about vacant lots here that are not, like a vacant city lot, for example, where you cannot discern what was necessarily there or not. You need to know the history of the site to find out the potential of the contamination. And the way to go about that is what we call do a phase 1 environmental site assessment, or the acronym for that is ESA. So if you do that, or have that done rather, it encompasses a title search, a record search for the site, interviews with the neighbors surrounding the site, and a site walk across the site, a visual reconnaissance to see how things look. On the next slide, I talk a little bit about, you can also do that sort of yourself. A phase 1 is not that expensive. I mean, it kind of depends where you are. There are geographic cost differences. How big the site is plays a role, but they are usually like around, I would say, maybe $1,000 or so. If the phase 1 comes back and says, oh, there was like maybe, as an example, a dry cleaner here or a gas station, then that would be a recognized environmental condition, meaning that you do want to do some sampling to make sure that the site is safe to do whatever you want to do there, right? So you take some environmental samples, have that done by an environmental professional, and that's what's called then a phase 2 environmental site assessment. So during that phase 1, nobody takes samples. It's just record search, research, finding out what was going on at the site, talking to people, but then based on the result, the sampling would occur to make sure everything is safe. For the phase 1 and 2 in Missouri, you have free resources. You don't need to pay for that. As an organization, individuals cannot do that. You need to go through the city or through a not-for-profit. But you could contact MDNR, and I put the brownfields coordinator's name here. His name is Jacob Roeder. Here's the phone number. Here is his email. So if you want that done for any site that you are involved with, that you're thinking about, go through, I think Springfield Community Gardens would probably qualify as a recipient of these services, and get that done for free. You do not need to go out then and get a contractor on board. This is all done by an MD&R. So you just kind of fill out a 2-page application for this. Whenever they're ready, they have several contractors on hand. They come out, do the work, and you just get the report. And you don't need to do your own sampling. You don't need to do this. They do all that for you. Okay. There was my fly-in. All right, so here it is. So you get the free phase 1 and phase 2. If MD&R runs out of money, they will ask EPA Region 7 to step in. Usually that takes a little bit longer. MD&R seems to be a lot faster with that, and based on past experience, but both these entities will be able to do that for free for you. You also can, if that is what you wish to do, you can contract with an environmental consulting firm of your choosing, and of course they will charge you for that. So if you, especially the phase 1, you can do that yourself, really. You just need to know where to look and where to go to get the information that you need. So here are some standard historical sources that you can access, such as, here we go, one more back, aerial photographs. You can go on Google Earth. They have like the imagery for, I don't know how far they go back, depends on the city, depends on the site, but sometimes it's definitely several decades, if not more. The Historical Society, they are usually good at having old aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, and I show you how one looks like. The Sanborn maps, they are very detailed. And the Library of Congress has free access to those. A lot of them are digitized now. They don't have them all. So if there's a particular one that you're looking for, maybe your own library has them, maybe a university library in your vicinity has them. Sometimes even the historical societies have the maps that are relevant to them. Property tax files, anything publicly accessible, you can access, like recorded land title records, local street directories, building department records. This is all city stuff. And newspaper archives can be interesting, because you can see if there was an incident related to the site, like say there was a structure and it burned down, or there was a service station and they had a huge spill. So all that information is out there. You just need to look for it. And I mean, that takes time, obviously. So here's an example of a Sanborn map. This is for Springfield. This is East Commercial here, Mill Street. This is from 1886, and this is from 1933. So you can see color-wise, it's a little bit different. These are the digitized maps. And I don't know how big that pops up on your screen, but the detail here sometimes, I mean, somewhere here, I think there was like a peanut factory, peanut butter factory. I think this is it here. So you can see what the use was for certain structures. And sometimes they actually put in, if they were like above ground storage tanks for like a gas station, if there were wells or anything like that. So it doesn't hurt to look at those. So here, where do you get historic? Oh, God. Okay, the county courthouse. I mean, that should be your first stop, right? You check the planning files to see the prior uses of the property. Were there any permits issued on the property that might be of interest to you? You can check the chain of title. You check for environmental liens. Usually the title says the land use and the land use limitations, if there are any, like institutional controls. For example, there was a spill or something, and there cannot be daycares or kindergartens or anything like that. Or it says the groundwater underneath the site is contaminated, hence you cannot drill a well on this property. So all that information should usually go with the title. Any type of public agencies like fire departments, health departments, the police, obviously your state environmental agency and the regional EPA office. You can always ask them to search for an address and see what they have on file. Under the Sunshine Law, I mean, that is all publicly accessible. You may have to fill out a little bit of paperwork to get that instead of just, doing a phone call and the guy or the lady at the other end will say, oh yeah, let me just check, on this address, see what I have. So it might take a little bit of time, but it's always there. And obviously any public databases, again, State Environmental Agency, EPA, and what have you. Fire department, again, like a response to an emergency at the site. Or on the other hand, you could contract with an environmental record search company. So all of this is if you want to do this on your own, right? And you don't want to go the route free through MDNR or EPA. So these environmental record search companies, they search all the records for you that I just mentioned. It's a lot faster. You might still want to do your own chain of title search. Sometimes they charge extra for that. And then, of course, most consulting companies use these services provided by these environmental record search companies. And you will end up with like a 20, I don't know, guessing here 10, 20 page report, depending on how that site is. They usually put a radius around the site of anywhere from 1 to 3 miles, so you can see what's around the site that may have negatively impacted the site, like service stations, dry cleaners, and what have you. So I put some resources here. These are available at this at the URLs that I list here that we put together when we had this big EPA grant to look at the contaminant uptake into food crops on brownfield sites. So historical proper usage and implications, and how to obtain property information in site history. Okay, are there any questions up to this point? I cannot see the chat right now, so if there are any, Anna, can you help out?
Yeah. No questions so far. I'm glad that those resources exist, but it definitely sounds like if you're looking for that information, you still have to do a bit of legwork.
Yeah, if you want to do it yourself, right? I mean, if you say, hey, MDNR, I'm a not-for-profit, I'm a city, I want to have a garden on the site. Can you do a phase 1 and a phase 2, if necessary, a phase 2 site assessment? Then all that is done for you.
Yeah. Okay. Very good to know. But yeah, no other questions at this time.
Okay. All right. So now we're moving on to collecting soil samples for analysis. Like say you did your site history, there is something there, you just don't know exactly what it might be and what the concentrations are, right? I mean, does it require any type of remedial action? Does it require any type of precautions that you want to take? Because what the result of the soil analysis will dictate what you can or cannot do on the site. And maybe after you get this back, you say, hey, you step back and say, nope, I'm not going to touch this site for gardening. But I mean, it's like facts that guide you through that and guide you through the process and end up with your decision then. So why would you sample and test your soil? Obviously, you want to know you're touching the soil with your hands, right? I mean, when I garden, I don't wear gloves. I know there are people who constantly wear gloves, but not everybody does that all the time. So you want to know what you're working in. You need to know what kind of soil amendments you need to apply, maybe as a best management practice, but also if you're testing for agronomic parameters like organic matter, like pH, nutrients, you need to know what and how much you need to apply to get the yields that you want, right? And first and foremost, you want to be safe.
A quick question, Sabine.
Yes.
Someone's asking how far back you should check the site's history.
That's a good question. I mean, normally when they do a phase 1, I think they go, what is the minimum? I'm not 100% sure, but at least 30 years sticks in my mind. And in some instances, after the site was first built upon. Like say that was farmland until, I don't know, I'm guessing in 1820. So as of 1830, 1820, they would look at records.
Gotcha. Okay.
I mean,
So
the
kind of
further back,
depends
the
on the
better.
site and how, yeah. Okay. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
Okay, so the questions, here's some questions you want to ask, right? And obviously, yes, is there contamination? If so, how much is it? And does the site require environmental cleanup? We already talked about that. But that will then lead you to the decision, am I growing in ground here or above ground, meaning in raised beds? Or am I just going to step away from the whole thing? And I mean, also what guides in ground, above ground is obviously who will work in the garden, adults, kids, does the garden need to be ADA accessible? And then of course here, what are the general soil conditions? That goes more to agronomic parameters, so not necessarily environmental. And then what crops will be grown. So mostly we're talking to address here in ground, above ground, and BMPs with the sampling. So for environmental testing, again, like your phase 2, which this is about, your phase 1 says, okay, there was a dry cleaner, a gas station, a commercial facility. Whatever you test for here now, you will find out if there is contamination and how much. And again, here, these are the phase 2 environmental site assessments. If you sample for metals, metals are not hard to sample for. You can actually do that yourself if that is the only concern, if there is nothing else there, right? And then you can contract with a commercial lab, or like Extension will, in some instances, K-State does. I don't know if MU does. We offer metal analysis, and it's fairly cheap. So you can take your own samples. That's why I have this DYI there, but only for metals. I would not sample for anything else because there are certain things that one needs to observe, and you want a representative sample. I mean, your results are only as good as, the sample that you take. And we go over that a little bit later in more detail. So for agronomic testing, meaning your pH, your organic matter, your nutrient status, you can do that yourself, of course. And you have access to commercial labs, but the cheapest way usually is to go through the extension service, universities, and they can tell you exactly how you should take your sample, how much they need, and all this good stuff. So pH is important for many different reasons. I mean, obviously, when you grow, you want to be probably right around, I don't know, I'm guessing here 7.5, 8, depending what your soil is like. But if you have a low pH, that means that you have a higher mobility of cations, which means metals. And you don't want that. You don't want these metals to move potentially into your produce, into the roots. So that's why you always need to kind of see that you are more or less right around neutral. So that's why the pH is important. And I just put that little chart up there. Sometimes when I talk about this, I'm just going to point out that this is the pH about 2 and 2.5 is extremely low for Coca-Cola. So all of the soda drinkers in the audience. So that's why pH is important. So you definitely want to test for that. And usually when you do the packets with Extension, that usually is included. They do pH, they do organic matter. Organic matter is important also because it binds contaminants and reduces the availability of metals to be uptaken by produce, whatever you grow. And then, of course, we have the nutrient status, also very important for good yields. And especially phosphorus is important because it also binds metals and reduces the bioavailability. So you definitely want to do the agronomic sample. And I think you probably all do that anyhow, maybe even on an annual basis, definitely for nutrient status, but also for the environmental samples. Having a plan for your garden, and we're talking a garden that you are freshly establishing, right? I mean, you're starting with a clean slate here. You can lay out your garden however you want. So there are two schools of thought here regarding testing and sampling. Either you have a plan beforehand and you know exactly where you want to have what, as far as garden beds, as far as walkways are concerned. And in that case, obviously, you only need to test the areas if you want to grow in ground that you are going to be planting later. Or the other way around would be I test the entire site and then let the results guide where I'm going to put things. So if I have, for example, I want to place a garden shed somewhere, then that could go somewhere where I have elevated concentrations of lead, for example, because that wouldn't affect anything. So those are the two things to go by. Growing in ground versus above ground. So that's also, there are several decision makers here, right? I mean, it's the liability. I mean, we've worked with communities that say if they own their own community garden governed by the city, it says we don't want any type of liability whatsoever. We don't care what's in the soil. We just go to raised beds right away. No testing, no nothing. That's what we do. Also kind of depends on the comfort level of gardeners regarding residual contamination. Obviously, when you test the soil as an organization, you want to let the gardeners know what they're getting into, right? So they can be informed and then make an informed decision as to what they want to do. Soil conditions are important. There are some areas of the country where you need to work so much with the soil anyhow to make it usable for a garden. Like say you have heavy clays like we have here sometimes in Kansas and also probably in Missouri. You need to add so much compost to the soil and so many nutrients and, check the pH and whatever organic matter that you might be better off going to raised beds right away because the cost might be the same, if not less, if you go to raised beds, depending what your source for clean soil is. And I'm saying clean because whatever you put in the raised beds, you want to have that tested. Accessibility, that goes back to who works in the garden, cost, space. Raised beds take up space because you need to be able to walk around a bed or a raised bed, and you want to have space for wheelbarrows. So that could be a consideration as well. The other thing to note is the amount of money you have, right? Your sampling budget for sampling. So this all goes to, you want to do it yourself. You don't get a phase 2 through the state. You're going to go and check the site yourself to see what's there. And you are aiming at growing in ground. So then you need to decide, okay, with the budget that I have, how many samples can I afford? And cost for samples, especially, across the board, agronomic samples as well as environmental samples vary by location. What lab does what? How much do they charge? And then, of course, you have the sampling approach. If you do it yourself, what will give you the info you need to make a decision regarding the site? So I'm going to run you through some scenarios here. You can sample selectively, meaning you sample only areas of interest. For environmental sampling, that might be an area where the vegetation is stressed. Not because of drought, because something is dying there because it didn't get enough water this summer, but continuously stressed. Like anything around it is green, but you have this footprint there, like a circle or whatever it is, and nothing grows there. So that's a red flag. So you definitely want to sample that. Low areas can be of interest where surface water tends to pool because that surface water may carry something that might not be so good. Around residential structures, and I mentioned this before because people tend to, or in the past, I should say, they sprayed around foundations for vermin and other foundations, former foundations. I'm thinking grocery stores here. They definitely sprayed because they didn't want to have any vermin entering the store and contaminate their wares. And a lot of the sprays that were out there in the past contained some form of arsenic. And then, of course, going back to your record search, you want to sample at locations where the historical records identify either the storage and or use of potential contaminants. So maybe you identified through your research that there was an area where they stored drums, or there were above ground storage tanks for petroleum products, or they stored pesticides, or they sprayed an area. So that kind of stuff. So that would be selective sampling, right? Then there is systematic sampling, where you actually establish a grid pattern across the site to identify your sampling locations. So this is not going by, okay, nothing grows here, or there was something there. It's just a grid. It can be anywhere from 10 by 10 to 100 by 100 feet, depending on the size of your site, obviously. And then you take samples at intersecting grid points. This type of approach generates a lot of samples, and usually much more than when I would do selective sample. What can be done to reduce the analytic costs a little bit is you can combine samples, and instead of having individual samples, you might just say, for this quadrant, maybe I do a composite sample with these 4 samples, and I'll talk a little bit later what this means. But this generates the most samples and hence the highest budget. And then you have random sampling. So like say you're planning different garden beds, then you would say you would take several samples throughout that garden bed location, the future garden bed location, and you would combine them into a composite sample. Or you could, like if your property is right by a street and you're going to plant garden beds alongside the street, you would take a few samples within maybe 10 to 20 feet along that particular property boundary. Reason being, for lead, think leaded gasoline, exhausts, so closer to the street, you usually have higher lead concentration. I'm saying usually. You can also, with this approach, you can start out with a smaller number of samples, and then if needed, you can take more later on based on the analytical results, right? If some of your results come back very high or higher than you feel comfortable with, you can go back and take more samples. So this here is a total randomized approach, and then a lot of people also do this zigzag pattern across, like say, a flower bed, a vegetable bed, and kind of combine samples to make a composite sample that way. So that's random. So just briefly, individual versus composite samplings. Obviously, an individual sample is one sample at a specific location or a specific depth. A composite sample is basically equal parts of multiple individual samples, can be up to 8 to 10 samples. You mix them all together to form one composite sample, and then you take some of that composite sample, put it in a jar, put it in a baggie, and send it off to the lab. So with the composite sample, you can get a result, but obviously, yes, you get a result, but it's an average concentration over a larger area. So it's cheaper that way, because instead of, like, say, 8 individual samples, you have one composite sample. But the caveat is, if, for example, your composite sample comes back high, remember, it's an average. You don't know where in this area that you sampled is that high concentration. Is it everywhere? Is it one spot where the concentrations were so high that it affected all the other composite samples? So that's a disadvantage of a composite sample. But initially, it gives you an idea. And as I said, you always can go back and take more samples if you need to. So that leads us to, how many samples do you need? Obviously, it depends, like, on the detail you need on the site of your site, of your nature of the site, and most importantly, also on your budget. The more samples you have, obviously, the better your information is. So with selective sampling, you will probably take more individual samples and not necessarily composite samples. But when you do grid and random samples, that's usually the approach where samples can be at least initially composited. So really, I mean, it's how many samples? Up to you. How much money do you have? How much information do you need? But you want to get information that you can work with, right? I mean, you don't want to take too few samples and then, I mean, you basically waste a lot of money and you're not any further along in making a decision. The other question that we get a lot, like if I do that, and that also goes for agronomic samples, to what depth should I sample, right? Like, and our response is always, well, what do you grow? How deeply does it root? So for most vegetables under good growing condition, that's about 6 inches. Think like lettuce. Tomatoes or larger root crops under good growing conditions, meaning they get enough water, roots can be a foot long. I've grown some tomatoes and apparently they didn't get enough water when we were gone this summer. And I pulled the tomato plants in the fall and they had roots like 2-3 feet long because they were going everywhere, down as well as lateral. But you obtain samples from surface to approximate rooting depths. So the image that I put in here is not for vegetables, it's for grasses, but you can see the different rooting depth that exists. So this is Kentucky bluegrass here, this little bitty thing. You can see hardly any roots. That's what most of us have in our lawns. That's what we need to water so much this summer. So if you look here at the lead plant or Missouri goldenrod or the compass plant, see how deep those roots are. So they can obviously withstand much more drought than our poor little lawn here. Every vegetable has different rooting depths. So this is just general, 6 inches, a foot. And the qualifier here was under good growing conditions. If you stress your plants, they didn't get enough water, they don't live in well-drained soil, they live in nutrient-deprived soil, that might vary then. So how do you take a sample? You selected your location, you know now how deep you need to take the sample to, from surface to rooting depth. This is what you need: a clean trowel, shovel or spade, clean plastic bucket for composite samples only, because when you mix 6 or 7 samples together, you want to have a bucket or something else that is clean to mix them in. For agronomic samples, usually resealable plastic bags. This does not go for environmental samples. 1 or 2 cups of soil free of debris, so pick out all the pebbles and the root bits that are in there. Again, for environmental samples, 1 to 2 cups. There are some samples that only require like little teeny tiny jars full, glass jars full. When you do take, well, let's go through here. Steel tools for metals, because you don't want any contamination from other than what's in the soil, potentially to transfer into the soil for metals analysis. For environmental samples, they will need to get sent to a commercial lab for analysis. Usually the lab will send you sample containers. They will tell you how much they need, and they will tell you also at what temperature you need to store your samples. Some samples require refrigeration to 4 degrees C. Always depends what you sample. But especially with environmental samples, what you need to take care of is that you do not cross-contaminate soil samples. Remember, your result is only as good as the sample you take. So if you contaminate from one location to the next, it's worthless, the result. So you want clean tools. You need to clean your tools with soap and water between each sample location. You clean your hands between sample locations after you take each sample. Best thing is you get disposable gloves, and after each sample, you switch gloves. For agronomic samples, they would like the samples dry in the lab, but air dry. Do not use a hair dryer. So most of this really is common sense. But again, like if you take environmental samples, if you do it yourself for the metals especially, the lab will send you some containers usually. So for the analysis, if you do the phase 2 environmental site assessment, there is no cost for these analyses. It's all free. And as I said before, you can get it through MDNR, or if MDNR is running out of money, they will defer back to EPA Region 7 in Kansas City. Fee-based MU extension, they definitely can do agronomic parameters, meaning pH, organics, nutrients. I do not know if they can do metals. I think they do, but I'm not sure. So you might want to hop on their website and see. K-State agronomy, what we do here, we can do the metals. We also do the agronomic parameters. Environmental laboratories, some do agronomic parameters, some don't. And then consulting firms, if you want to go that route, I mean, they contract with a lab, so you might as well immediately go to the lab, because some labs actually send technicians to take environmental samples. So it might cost a little bit more because there's labor involved. Consulting firm, I mean, they definitely will charge you more because they send somebody out. And yeah, all of this is fee-based here. So you have choices, lots of choices. Questions for this part?
We don't have any that have come up.
Okay. Then we move right along. All right, so this is the first little interactive piece, if you want to. This is a site that we had for research purposes in Kansas City. It's in a residential area. You see different site photos, so you get a feel for the site. This was a vacant home here on this side. This is the vacant home on another side. On this particular site here, the guess was that there were 3 homes at one point in time, something like this. I mean, typical inner urban homes, narrow but long. Usually in the past, these homes, I mean, they were all built, I'm guessing here, 1910, 1920. They had garages in the back. So there was an alleyway. So the street is here. Alleyway would have been like here. This is an aerial. You see this a little bit better. So that was the one vacant home. The other one is kind of, can't see it because of the trees. This is the site here, and the alleyway would have been here. So the question, based on what you heard so far, is this is the site. Here is the street. There is this vacant residence here. There's a vacant residence here. And this is where very likely the 3 homes at one point in time were on this site. If you wanted to make this into a community garden, A, would you sample? And B, where would you sample? So Anna can open up the mic so you all can voice your opinions if you want to.
Yes, let me know if we have any brave souls who want to put their knowledge to the test. But we can allow you to talk, or you can always put it into the comments. So you're asking where and what to test?
Yeah, I mean,
what was that last
the first obvious question is, would you test the site? Would you take samples?
Okay, all right.
And the second question would be, if your answer is yes to that, then where would you sample and why?
Oh, Kendra, thank you. One of our staff members. Hey, Kendra.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I would definitely want to test the site, and I would specifically want to test the street facing side. Anywhere that they would be closer to like runoff from like gasoline or something, like any kind of fluids that go into a vehicle. I feel like that's a good start for where you'd find some heavy metal contamination.
Yep, mostly from the exhaust. So that's definitely, so like anywhere like between, 10 feet in, 20 feet in, depending where your actual site boundary is. Yes, so that's a good one. Where else? Think about the foundations.
Indra, do you have another guess of where else to test?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was me still.
Or anybody, whoever.
I guess, yeah, you'd want to test close to where the foundations of the home used to be, in case there were like garages or something like that. Again, I'm just really thinking like where automotive vehicles would have been.
So that would have been in the back somewhere here, because there would be the alley right here, right? This would be the fronting the street. Garages were in the back. And like way back when, they all changed their own oil usually, and there were no regulations, so people just kind of discarded the waste oil onto the soil. So that's definitely a valid point, sampling back here. The other thing I would say is you want to sample around the foundations. Take at least maybe like 3 samples for pesticides, DDT or DDE, because that was used to spray around the foundations for rodents back then. And the other thing also, because this is Kansas City, lots of people build with wood siding. So whenever they paint their homes, they would scrape off the blistered paint, and that paint at that point in time was leaded paint, right? So you would have potentially more lead closer to where these homes were. Does that make sense?
I hate thinking about that. All the paint chips and just people not knowing how dangerous it was. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So we actually sampled that site, and what we did, we sort of put a grid over it, right? It was not quite quite straight at that point in time, but you can see here the lead concentrations in milligrams per kilogram. So again, this slide might be familiar. I used that before. The darker colors indicate the higher lead concentrations. And yes, so this was where the street was. So you could say, yeah, okay, there's more lead here than there's there, not much in the alley. There's something here, God knows why, because this was the property boundary to the next building. And it could be that they, maybe they painted their structure more. The problem with these sites is because they were the 3 homes there and they got demolished. The soil definitely was disturbed. And especially for the homes in this area, they all had basements. And the practice when they demoed the homes was to kind of schlop all the demolition debris into the basement and call it good. So it was really hard since everything got so disturbed, that's why you don't really clearly see where, like, for example, the outline of the former houses were, and that there was maybe more lead around it. So the point, I think, is, yes, you can have the best intentions with sampling and everything, but if you look at this map, there is really not that much rhyme or reason to it as to why it's, for example, there's more lead concentration in this area as opposed to up here. So that's why I'm thinking sampling is very, very important. So just that you nail it down. You can see here these little blue points. That's where we went back and took the pesticide samples, chlordane, DDT, and DDE, kind of guessing where the outline of the foundations of these former homes were, and not sampling all the way around it, but just taking some few sample points here and there to see what was there. And those all came back non-detect, which was a good thing. So it was just the lead here. And not that high. Remember I said 200 to 300 milligrams per kilogram are pretty standard. This is an urban area. So, this is not screaming high. Okay, any questions so far?
No, I think we can go ahead.
Good, good. All right, so the last bit, best management practices. So you establish your site history, you got soil analytical results, either for free or paid for. Anyhow, you know what you're dealing with now, and you decided to garden on the site, and now you kind of need to decide what best management practices do I need to apply. So here is a table that tells you like the recommendations for lead impacted soils. What should you do? So if you have less than 50 milligrams per kilogram lead in the soil, no special precautions are usually needed. Up to 250 milligrams per kilogram, vegetables are still all okay, but you want to limit any type of dust, meaning you keep the site moist, cover the walkways, mulch, and watch your kids. I mean, kids tend to, especially small kids, tend to stick everything in their mouth, and you don't want to have that happen here with the lead in the soil. 250 to 400 milligrams per kilogram, you don't grow root crops. Now, this all assumes that you are growing in the ground, right? That you do not have raised beds. 400 to 1,200 milligrams per kilogram, you don't grow root crops or low growing leafy vegetables, because like lettuce and chard, you get a lot of spray when it rains or when you water onto the leaves, and you may not clean every little soil speck off. Not that one little soil speck will kill you, but you want to avoid as much as possible getting a lot of lead contamination soil into your body, right? So that's where that precaution comes in. And then if your soil has more than 1,200 milligrams per kilogram in lead, then it's recommended not to grow any type of vegetables, use raised beds or other containers with clean soil. It's still okay to garden with like ornamentals, perennials, shrubs, or trees, with the precaution that you know that you don't want to have dust. And knowing what you garden in, meaning you take the common sense approach and wash your hands and dust off your clothes after you garden. You should do that anyhow, I would think, when you are gardening in concentrations around here. Here at the bottom, pretty much the same thing. It's just a different depiction. So the potential exposure pathways for anything that's in the soil, I mean, not only in this instant lead, but other metals potentially, is from the soil to the human, meaning you're breathing in soil via dust, the inhalation, and potentially the dermal contact. So you want to, that's the direct exposure pathway that might affect you. The indirect exposure, when it goes like whatever, like in, let's just do lead from the soil to the plant to the human, that's negligible. There is hardly anything. I would say there's nothing there. But this part here, that's where you need to take some precaution, hence the best management practices. So, and then let's just assume you're going to grow in ground. So, and you do need to take precautions. As I said, you need to amend your soils. You can use compost, you add organic matter, and this table shows you how the compost addition, in this case, diluted the total soil lead nearly by 50%. And you add clean compost. So whatever you add to the soil as far as compost or organic matter is concerned, make sure you either get that tested, or sometimes if you buy bulk, there are some distributors who will already analyze the compost, the organic matter that they sell for you, and they will be able to give you a copy of the analyses. Nutrient status, yeah, I mean, we already went through that. So that's just watch out for that. Make sure your nutrient status is where it needs to be. And the same with the organic matter. The ideal organic matter content depends on the soil type that you have. So usually below 1 to 3% organic matter can be considered low, but your extension service will know exactly how much you should shoot for here, because they know what soil type you're in, and you just need to tell them what area in the city. I'm assuming you all garden in and around Springfield you are, and they will be able to tell you what is ideal. pH we already talked about, to make sure that's okay. So these are all things like pH, nutrients, organic matter. You as a gardener are aware anyhow what needs to be done and where you need to be at. It's just that you have the added side effect here about reducing bioavailability if you do it right. pH adjustment, you can do that, of course. Here in Kansas, we don't need to increase alkalinity. We are all having limestone-based soil, so that's not the case here. But some people, depending on where you are, you need to either adjust up or down. And this explains a little bit as to how and with what you can achieve that. Crop selection. So I already mentioned that root crops in general take up more lead than leafy or fruit-bearing vegetables. So if lead concentration in your soil is a concern, you may not want to grow root crops, especially carrots. And you may want to, go to leafy and fruit crops. So the selection as to what you grow, that's also a best management practice. So here is a summary of what all you can do. Obviously here the soil amendments, compost biosolids, if you have those available to you, they are very good. Lots of nutrients, lots of organic matter. pH, watch that, nutrient levels, suitable crop types. To avoid dust generation, mulch your garden beds so you don't expose the soil. Cover your walkways. If need be, go to raised beds. That certainly is a best management practice. Education, I would say, is also a best management practice, especially in a community garden type setting where you want to make sure that people are aware of what they are gardening in and what precautions, if any, they should take. Like best practices, best management practices could also extend to, you wash your hands after you're done gardening. You don't bring your kids into the garden if you're concerned. You dust off your clothes after you're gardening. You take your shoes off before you walk into your home after gardening, so you don't track any lead containing or whatever containing soil into your home if you're concerned. So a lot of it's common sense. I mean, you wash your vegetables so you don't have lingering soil particles on there, and you wash it well under flowing water and not just in a little container where you have a little bit of water in it. So, I mean, it's not rocket science, right? There's some additional resources here on that website that we have, so I put that link in there in case you're interested. A lot of gardeners, I shouldn't say a lot, but in some instances, it just makes a lot more sense to go to raised beds right away or after you get your test results back. At least in part of the site you're wanting to establish a garden in, especially if some areas of your garden have higher lead or other metal concentrations. So these are just some images of raised beds. I mean, there are all kinds of materials out there. A lot of people go with wood. If you paint them, make sure you're not using lead-based paint. It should be kind of hard to get by now. You can go with corrugated steel, corrugated metal, like containers. You can grow in bags like here, or you can use cinder blocks. I mean, there are all these different kind of designs depending on what you like and how much space you have and how much depth you need. I mean, this is not very, very tall here. Here we're talking pretty tall. ADA accessible, obviously, yes. I mean, you want to have beds that people maybe get their wheelchair under, or just at a good height where gardeners don't need to bend over that much. These beds here, this was one of our test sites. So we went to a little bit deeper, thicker, wider boards here. I think they were like a foot. It always it depends what you're growing, right? I mean, again, going back to the rooting depth. So if you just grow lettuce and such, you don't need to have a very deep raised bed. If you want to grow tomatoes, I would go minimum a foot. What they did here too, because it was in a highly contaminated area, and it was just for test purposes that we were growing here, they put the barrier down here. So really the soil and the produce roots could not go through and enter the actual ground. So that could be an additional precaution if that is desired. Usually it's not necessary. So this is the last interactive bit here. This is an actual site. It's in Springfield. Again, it's a residential area, and this is the area that was supposed to be converted into a garden. Shed's already here. This is like looking at it from the side. So shed here, house there, fenced area around the garden. Here's another view. This site, like when did we do that? Like, I think it was last year. Was it last spring? Not this spring, not 23, but in 22, I think. We, as in K-State, came out and tested that area. So what you can hear is the shed, right? This other residence is here. So this is the actual garden area. That's the little gate here. This one right here. And you can see we put a grid over it. And we screened for the soil for lead with a handheld XRF. And these are the screening results for that. In milligrams per kilogram, talking lead here, anything that is in blue is above 400 milligrams per kilogram, which is the limit that the US EPA set for soil for children play areas, 400 milligrams per kilogram. And like before, you know, it's not evenly distributed. Like here you have 1,090, 2,325. And I mean, that is high. And here a little bit less, but still high. So all the ones that we didn't mark here in blue, those are below, obviously, 400. And most of them are what you would kind of expect, you know, the 200 to 300 milligrams per kilogram, which is fairly common for urban soils. So my question to you is, based on what you know, what you heard, what would you do here? What best management practices would you apply? Because yes, the site is still to be used for growing vegetables. Any ideas?
Not seeing anyone in the chat, but we're looking for solutions. So this site, it is a community garden and had contamination we tested for, and we've got to do something with it. We'd like to keep it on as a garden. So any ideas as to what our solutions might be?
Think about what we just talked about, like the best management practices that you could apply here. Is there anything that would make sense for the site?
Okay, a couple people have put into the comments raised beds with barriers, and Kendra, thank you for participating, Kendra, says definitely growing in raised beds. Another person says that you could follow the grid with the appropriate kinds of vegetables and maybe growing more flowers instead of edible food.
All good ideas. Raised beds, absolutely an option, because I mean here, and I'll show you something in a minute here that kind of reinforces that maybe a little bit. If you follow the grid, this is like the distance in feet between sampling points. So basically we sort of like 10 by 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the one thing that could be said is, yes, I know that the concentration here is 217 and here it's 240, but here it's 699. Who's to say that it's not 699 here too, right? I mean, the point is, I mean, you cannot sample every single speck of soil that you have, so you need to interpolate. So, but these values here, yeah, I mean, you could grow pretty much anything you wanted to. What's kind of weird to me was like these really, really high values here, because it's not directly on the property line where you would think, okay, they painted the house, you know, they put chipped paint down, and that's what caused these high concentrations only here. That was not the case. So there must be something else going on. So that might, in this particular site, it would be really interesting to see historically what was there. Was it always a residence? Was there something else? You know, I mean, anything you can. That's why I think historical information is so important. You might find out something. Okay, let me show you something else. This here is the soil at that site. Very, very clay. I mean, gosh, you could mold a cup out of this. That's another consideration here, you know, because like to work in this soil, and it was not like that at all at every location that we sampled. There was a location somewhere in a corner where somebody had put a lot of compost down already, and they had grown sweet potatoes, I believe, in that area. So there the soil was different. It was more fit in quotes for gardening. But this stuff, I mean, just think about the amount of compost you put down and the organic matter content to improve the soil to a point where you can actually get good yields out of this. So that could also in this instance be a decision driver as to what to do with it. So, okay, let me just, so Anna, do you want to say what the decision was, what to do with the site?
Oh, sure. Yes. And if you're following along with SCG, this is our Pacific Street garden. And as Sabine said, yeah, we tested for heavy metals just a couple years ago and stopped, and it came out very high. So we stopped production, but finally we're able to get it up and running again. We have ordered 12 raised beds that are 36 inches high. And we're going to have those on a grid on the site so that there's enough room for wheelbarrows to go in between and people to walk around comfortably. And we have a foundation that has also donated some fence. So, you know, we'll be able to keep the site very contained and, yeah, in a nutshell, raised beds. But we're really excited that we have a path forward now with Sabine and many other people's help, because we wanted to keep this site. It's very important where it's located, and we thought it would be a great example of, you know, a very common urban issue that people face. So it has not been a very fast process, because we really were not sure what to do, and we wanted to be absolutely positive that we were proceeding in a safe manner, especially if, you know, this food is being distributed out to the community. So raised beds for the win at the Pacific Street Garden.
And I'm assuming like the walkways, I mean, you will keep that covered or put grass down or whatever, like, so you don't have bare soil.
Yes, definitely going to be very aware of the bare soil out there.
Good. Yeah, I think that's an extremely good solution. I mean, a lot of times, again, it always depends what kind of budget you have at your disposal, right? I mean, in a lot of instances, gardeners need to weigh, okay, I buy the materials for the raised bed. I buy the soil. Can I get it in bulk, or do I need to get bags? How many bags do I need to get, and how do I transport that, right? All this kind of stuff. Do I have analyses? Because again, you want to fill the beds with clean soil. One thing I also should say, there was a compost pile in the back of the site, which we also tested. And it's not on here. Well, actually, you can see it here in the picture, right here by the shed. That compost had lead in it. It wasn't screaming high, but it was pretty much comparable to, I think it was like around 200, if I remember correctly. So that's, I think it's why it's important to test whatever you incorporate, what you import into your site, to make sure you don't exacerbate the problem. And then a lot of times, as I said, you just need to weigh the cost. You know, what makes more sense to achieve the goal that I want to have. I mean, sometimes for some gardeners, it might be cost prohibitive to get raised beds. Because Anna, do you know, was the cost very high for your beds?
I think so. I don't know the exact cost, but with them being so high, and you know, we're not doing it ourselves.
Yeah.
We're purchasing them outright. So I'm not sure of the
Right.
exact amount, but yeah, they're on the pricier side when it comes to raised beds.
Yeah. If you do build beds yourself, what I would say is don't get pressure treated lumber, because there is still pressure treated lumber out there that where the treatment that lumber got contained arsenates. And there should be, like, you know, when you buy lumber, you have this little stapled on sticker on there. I think they are required by law to tell you if there is arsenic or arsenate in the was used in the treatment process or not. So I just, as a rule, I just stay away from that if I possibly can. Most of the time I
That's a
can.
great tip. Great tip. Avoid pressure treated lumber.
Yeah.
We have another question. Do we know if our city compost has been tested for lead and such? Which, Sabine, you're not based out of Springfield, but so that's definitely something we should check on. But to your knowledge, is that a common practice of facilities that sell compost?
It depends on the location. And like with city compost, yeah, you never know. I mean, you just need to call them up and ask, right? I mean, my guess would be it's not. But if it's not, I mean, you can just go there, you take a sample, just make sure you get it from the batch that you actually are gonna get your compost from then, you know, because sometimes if they have windrows, you just want to make sure I mean, it, you know, it can vary what they sell at a given day, but and get that tested. I mean, I hate to say a wrong number, but I would say metals, just if you want to have a soil sample tested for lead, it should not cost you more than $15, give or take. I mean, it's cheap.
Okay. Okay.
And if I mean, if MU Extension does that, that is really your cheapest way to go.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, so you can get that done. But the other problem with, well, not problem, our compost here, I mean, we have a city compost. I mean, there's street sweepings in there, right? And there is other stuff in there. In ours, oh gosh, we had plastic and wires. I mean, they tried to get some of that big stuff out, but you still have, there are a lot of weed seeds in there too, at least in ours. And that varies. I mean, always, it varies how a city composts.
Okay.
So all my actually long-winded answer, just call them up and ask them what they have, what they test for.
We will do that, and we'll make sure to put it out on our social media channels definitively what they say. So thank you for that. And someone in the chat was also talking about, I believe in St. Louis, perhaps, where arsenic was, or no, I'm sorry, I'm conflating two things. Someone saying that arsenic was removed from pressure treated lumber in 2004. Are you aware of any, at least arsenic being phased out?
Oh, could
of
be
treated
2004.
lumber?
But I mean, depends like if somebody still has some stock lying around, you know, where you get your lumber from.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
never hurts to check.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Good tips, definitely. Things to look out for that the average person would not think to.
Any other questions, concerns, anything?
I'm not seeing any. No, I don't think anything else is popping up in the chat right now.
Okay, I'm gonna go here. If you do have any questions later on, you can just call me, you can email me, you can, you know, contact Anna. She can contact me, whatever works for you.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Well, thank you, Sabine. This is very important. And I really do thank everyone who was able to join us today. This is an issue. We don't want to make anyone sick when we're trying to feed them the, very best healthy local food that we can offer. So thank you, everyone. And like I said, we'll make sure to put this recording up on YouTube here shortly. All right. You take care. Thank you, Sabine.
Sounds good. Thanks for listening. Bye.